Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation, Addressing Challenging Client Situations with Cultural Humility. My name is Jennifer Trujillo, and I'm the Substance Use Disorder and Special Populations Program Manager at the Nevada Primary Care Association. Nevada Primary Care Association helps community health centers provide exceptional medical, dental, and behavioral health care to Nevadans by advocating policy changes, providing training and technical assistance, and creating economies of scale through program management. For more information regarding our PCA or to subscribe to our newsletter, please visit us at nvpca.org. This presentation is a partnership between the Nevada Primary Care Association and the Opioid Response Network. I just want to take a moment to thank them for helping us coordinate this session. Before we get started, I would like to go over logistics and housekeeping items for today's presentation. Please type your name and organization into the chat box. It's nice to see who in the community is attending this presentation today. During the presentation, please mute your phone or computer so we do not have feedback or background noise. Also, please do not put your phone on hold or we will hear your hold music. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to the presenter by typing your questions into the chat box. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. Questions will be collected and addressed during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's presentation will be recorded and slides will be available to participants. I will turn over the presentation to Ben Nguyen, Clinical Specialist for the Opioid Response Network, to talk about his presenter and organization. Ben, please take it away.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin Nguyen, and I'll be introducing your presenter, Dr. Thomas Fries, and he'll be addressing challenging client situations with cultural humility. And Dr. Fries is the director of the Pacific Southwest Addiction Technology Transfer Center and the UCLA Integrated Substance Abuse Programs at the Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. Next slide, please. So just a little background on who we are, how this was supported today. Dr. Tom Fries was brought on board to present here and share his expertise and knowledge about cultural humility through SAMHSA State Targeted Response Technical Assistance Grant, which created the Opioid Response Network. And this was really designed to assist STR grantees and individuals and organizations by providing resources and technical assistance to address the opiate epidemic locally. And technical assistance is available to support different types of evidence-based prevention, treatment, and recovery of opioid use disorders. Next slide, please. And so the Opioid Response Network provides local experienced consultants in prevention, treatment, and recovery to communities and organizations to help address the opioid epidemic. And so we accept any types of requests for education and training or even types of implementation project support. And each state and territory has a designated team led by a regional technology transfer specialist like myself. And really, I oversee operationalizing the work, taking different needs and ideas and requests, inquiries, and translating them into actionable items or deliverables, such as today's training. So in this case, Jen from Nevada Primary Care Association and Brandy had put together this training through the State Opioid Response Grant. And so we were able to help provide a speaker to address and bridge different types of gaps and bring in more content that can create more innovation. Next slide, please. So if you have any questions or would like to submit a technical assistance request, you can visit our website at www.opioidresponsenetwork.org or email orn@aap.org. And you can also call the number right there too. Next slide, please. And I think, and basically the only last thing is funding for this initiative was made possible in part by this grant by SAMHSA. So we are not representatives of SAMHSA, and so the views expressed or written in conference materials or publications or anything in this presentation, it does not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, or any trade names mentioned, commercial entities, does not imply any endorsement by the U.S. government. Next slide, please. And really our approach here is to build upon existing efforts enhance and refine and fill in the gaps where needed rather than recreating the wheel. And that's why we're able to work locally with the NVPCA to tap into local networks instead of introducing just a new product to you all. Next slide, please. And this is our overall mission, to provide training and technical assistance via these local experts and to enhance prevention, treatment, and recovery, addressing these local and state-specific needs. Next slide, please. And that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Thomas Fries, where he'll be taking you through a whirlwind of cultural humility, and these are just a snapshot of what you'll be able to take home after this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ben. Thanks to Jen and Brandy and the Nevada Primary Care Association as well for inviting me today. Full disclosure, I'm also the director of the Pacific Southwest Opioid Response Network, which Ben is one of our technical assistant specialists, technology transfer specialists, and I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you about cultural humility. You know, that when we originally wrote this particular presentation, it was sort of a different world. It was prior to COVID-19 and all of the associated interpersonal changes that we've had to make. And it was prior to the murder of Floyd and all of the sort of uprisings that have happened since then. And I think it's important when we talk about culture and cultural humility that we put it in context of the world that we live in now. It is certainly the case that race and racism has been around for a very, very long period of time, but we have the opportunity to look at it in a slightly different way as we examine the world today. The presentation that we're going to do today isn't directly about race and racism, but more about our own personal responsibility in understanding cultural and cultural context in how we deliver services. And I really want to make that distinction, and we can discuss it more after the presentation if you would like. But this is really about how do I position myself as a professional in the world in relationship to other people, some of whom I may understand some of the cultural issues that they're experiencing, and sometimes I may not, and how do we deal with that? So we're going to look at substance use disorders as a chronic condition and look at how to deal with sort of the collaborative treatment planning and service delivery. And we're going to look specifically at cultural humility and its central importance in being able to deliver effective care to individuals. We'll look at strategies and treatment approaches that are consistent with cultural humility and client-centered approaches to care, and how to bring those client-centered approaches forward. And then we'll look at strategies for applying cultural humility to client behaviors and to client interactions in relationship to their expressions of recovery, morality, and preferred approaches to treatment, and when they're in concert and when they're in conflict with our beliefs and approaches to those same things. So we're going to start with trends and definitions, then we'll look at some specific examples, and then we will end with some recommendations. If you have questions, please do type them into the chat as we go along, and Ben is going to help me with those. And anything that's particularly relevant that we need to talk about right away, he'll help me introduce, and then we will have a longer question and answer session toward the end of the session. To start out with, I'd like you to imagine, if you would, that you're visiting your sister after a recent visit to the doctor for numbness and tingling in her feet. She says that her doctors told her that she has diabetes and that she's stupid for letting her diet get so out of control. Your sister says the doctor's recommendation is that she see a dietitian and gain some self-control. Once she does that, he'll consider treating her diabetes directly with medicine. The doctor tells her any treatment with insulin or other medicines isn't going to do her any good unless she's really ready, and he'll know that she's ready when she loses some weight. So he tells her to come back when she really wants to change, and no follow-up appointment is scheduled. I think that any person who has any understanding of diabetes, let alone just sort of general good patient care, would say that this is a terrible treatment plan for this young woman. And addressing her disease directly is really what needs to happen in the moment. And no one would recommend this treatment plan for diabetes. But if we simply make one small change, and that is we replace her blood sugar disorder with a substance use disorder, this is indeed the treatment recommendation that a great many people, in fact, in many places, the majority of people get in their first attempt to initiate treatment, and sometimes for many attempts thereafter. If we don't see with compassion who this individual is in front of us and address the issues that they come in, we'll lose them to treatment today and maybe forever, and that could have devastating and potentially fatal consequences. So we need to address the words that we use and the values that those hold and how they express our attitudes. It's generally accepted that people should not be discriminated against because of health conditions or religion or race or any other issue. And yet, when it comes to the issue of substances, people continue to experience tremendous biases along with all of those other issues. So people also experience reactions to their race and ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender, their class, all of the characteristics that they walk into the world with. And we often refer to these things as stigma that they're experiencing. Now, stigma is what we're going to focus a lot on today. And I like to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about a concept. So I went to my friend Merriam Webster, that is, and I looked up stigma. And these are the definitions here. Number one, sort of relevant, a mark of disgrace or infamy. Number two is the one that I think really speaks to what we're talking about today. A stain or reproach on one's reputation. It's as if we put a mark on people's forehead and all we see in front of us is that mark on their forehead. We treat them as if the mark were true. We treat them according to that mark, and we fail to see the rest of the individual underneath that mark. The more we do that, the more we're treating the person with stigma instead of as an individual. I would posit to say that there are a lot of stigmatized conditions that people come in with, health conditions, but I would say that there's none that is more stigmatizing, maybe some that are as stigmatizing as issues of substance use disorder. What ends up happening when we stigmatize people is it delays entree to care. And as with many other conditions, we know that substance use disorders are potentially fatal conditions. And so the longer we delay, the more likely that harmful effects are going to come from the condition that they have. And therefore, the more likely that significant morbidity or mortality will ensue. Well, how do I know this is true, that these words make a difference? There are a number of studies that have been done looking at this particular issue. I'm only going to show you one today, and there are several others that are in the references to this presentation. But this was done, this study was done by introducing to people one of two scenarios. The scenarios were identical to each other, describing someone with a problem related to active use of drugs and alcohol. Again, the scenarios were identical, except for one small change between the two scenarios. In one, each time it was referred to, the person was referred to as a substance abuser. And in the other, the person was referred to as having a substance use disorder. Everything else was identical. Based solely on that one change, well, based on the scenario that they saw, people were asked to rate the person according to a number of different characteristics. And they looked at the differences between those two groups. Again, the only difference is substance abuser versus someone with a substance use disorder. Well, those who were found, who were described as being a substance abuser were thought to be less likely to benefit from treatment than the person having a substance use disorder. They were thought to be more likely to benefit from punishment, more likely to be socially threatening, more likely to be blamed for their substance-related difficulties, and to be thought that really that it was a condition over which they could control without help, and therefore should be able to just take care of it. So what we see is someone who's really thought to be sort of a bad person, not in need of care, as opposed to a person with an illness who would benefit from treatment. The words that we use are powerful. Now, as we talked about, this is not just the only characteristic that they walk in with, but their substance use issues intersect with a wide variety of other stigmatized conditions as well as demographics. And so intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how multiple social identities, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, class, disability, intersect at a micro level of individual experience to reflect interlocking systems of privilege and oppression. We use the terms racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, etc., to describe these interactions. Now, I do want to talk about one word that's in here that I think is really important, and it's the issue of privilege. Privilege is actually, in my opinion, a challenging word for a really important concept. And by challenging word, I mean it's really difficult for some people to get beyond the word. They think that privilege means they've lived with a silver spoon, they've never had any problems, and all of their life has been good, as opposed to everybody else. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about privilege. Privilege is simply having the advantage of your life being made better, or at least not being made worse, based on some characteristic that you have no control over. So based on your gender or your sexual orientation or your class, a disability, or race. If that is a stigmatized condition and you fall into one of those stigmatized groups, your life may be indeed, and probably is, more difficult in a variety of ways than someone who falls into the non-stigmatized portions of those groups. By definition, that's what we're talking about when we talk about privilege. And as people who fall into sort of multiple marginalized groups interact in the world, they experience stigma from each of these separately and in concert with each other. Often what we talk about is microaggressions. Now, microaggressions is a term that is sort of controversial right now. It's been around for quite some time, but many people are saying we shouldn't call them micro, meaning mini aggressions, but we should really talk about them as what they are, which is really overt stigma, overt ism, racism, sexism, etc., as opposed to minimizing them by calling them micro. But this is how the research that was done, this is the term that was developed as these concepts were developed. So I'm going to use it here today. I just want to acknowledge that it is somewhat of a controversial term right now. So when we look at microaggressions, we look at kind of the impact on the individual. So what does interpersonal microaggression or discrimination look like? Well, it could take the form of an unconscious bias. A statement like, I have no problem with gay people when they don't wear it on their sleeve. You see the young adolescent couple kissing in the park, and if they're heterosexual, it's cute. Two boys walking through the park holding hands are wearing it on their sleeve, and therefore it's a problem. She's so pretty, I couldn't even tell she was trans. So pushing hetero and gender normative, cisgender normative visions of beauty on others is another way that these microaggressions occur. They don't look like junkies. What does a substance user look like? But our biases begin to bleed out in that way. Is he really Muslim? He looks white to me. So again, another way that we begin, how we see people and the assumptions we put into them may indirectly or directly make them feel criticized, belittled, or less than the person that is speaking. So these microaggressions come in a variety of different forms, and this is just another way of looking at them. Very often, if someone doesn't look like a white person, we assume that they're foreign or an alien in their own land, for instance. People will say things like, "You speak such good English," assuming that they're a foreigner. We may attribute intelligence to who the person is and say things like, "You're a credit to your race," or "You're so articulate," indirectly indicating that a person of color is not as intelligent as their white counterparts. Or, I think, in many ways, even more insidious and difficult for people to see, colorblindness. I don't see color when I look at you, really denying the person's existence within the context of their racial or ethnic experiences. America's a melting pot, indicating that perhaps assimilation is better than staying true to your culture and figuring out how to operate within the cultural context within which you operate. So all of these things heap on an individual and add pressure to their overall existence in a variety of different ways. So intersectionality, looked at slightly differently, looks at all of the different groups that the person is affiliated with and kind of begins to think about which marginalized groups do you belong to versus which more privileged groups. And you can begin to see how all of these things overlap one with another, forming kind of a complex flower. But to really understand the complexity, I want to focus your attention on the center of this image. And if you look, all of the different ways that these issues intersect with each other, sometimes overlapping 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 on top of each other, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes 3 or 4. Each of those is a different experience of the world and the pressures that are heaped on the individual from the biases that they receive through all of these identities. So I'd like, if you would, for you to just take a minute and consider this list and your status within it. I'm not going to ask you to disclose. I'm just going to ask you to kind of count up the number of marginalized groups that you may belong to that may impact your experience in the world. For anyone who maybe have trouble reading due to visual impairments, etc., the categories are gender, sexual orientation, race or ethnicity, class or SES, weight, education level, substance use, mental health, legal status or issues, trauma, and then any others that aren't on this list. How many do you fall into? The larger that number is, great, thank you, Diana. The larger that number is, the more likely you are to have had more and more stigmatizing kinds of interactions heaped on you. The number for me is 5. I know people who go as high as 9 or 10 different stigmatized conditions. And if you begin to kind of separate those out, you can see where when you interact with the world, thank you, Griselda, you can see as you interact with the world that sometimes it's stigma just against one of these issues. Sometimes they come in combinations of multiplicatively beginning to compile on top of each other. So intersectionality really is associated, the more intersecting identities we have, the more likely you are to experience negative outcomes. So internalized substance use stigma is associated with poorer outcomes overall. But if you also have a mental health issue, you magnify the issues that are there. Substance use alone results in worse mental health and less engagement in substance use treatment services. If we add HIV-related stigma on top of that, we end up not only with those things, but an even greater association with depression than either of them alone. If you only have HIV or you only have substance use, both of those lead to some mental health-related issues and less engagement in treatment. But if you have both, you're more likely to have a more severe expression of depression than either of them individually. Sorry, that was kind of convoluted. Another example, Black and Latina sexual minority women are 4 times more likely to have substance-related issues than heterosexual women of color, and twice as likely as white sexual minority women, highlighting the importance of taking into consideration the multiple identities and the way that these multiple identities compound for the individual their ability to access services, their ability to take advantage of those services, and therefore the potential for negative outcomes ensuing. So another term that's coming under scrutiny a lot recently is minority stress. And minority stress looks at all of the ways that these intersecting identities operate within an individual. And again, this concept of minority stress, using the term minority, is coming under scrutiny because a lot of times people that fall into what we would typically call minority populations are actually the majority population in many situations, and yet they're still the more stigmatized population, and so they have been lumped into this category. So there's a real look at the languaging that we're using right now, but again, Meyer and colleague and others who looked at minority stress use that term, so I'm also going to use that term in describing this today. So minority stress looks at ways in which unique stressors experienced by a person from a particular minority group may relate to and experience disparities across a variety of health-related conditions. So minority stress theory suggests that sexual minority individuals, for instance, are at greater risk for health-related problems than heterosexual individuals because of a greater exposure to social stress related to prejudice and stigma. Prejudice-related stressful life events have specific, unique, harmful effects on an individual, and when we carry that stress throughout our lives, we end up suffering from a health and mental health perspective. If you're familiar with the adverse childhood experiences studies, for instance, the more adverse childhood events you've had, the more likely you are to have had a variety of negative health and mental health related outcomes. More and more as we understand that research, it's really about the accumulation of a lifetime of stress for that individual and what happens inside the body as you live your life under that constant level of stress. There was a study that was done specifically looking at HIV-related stigma, and I want to talk a little bit about it because I think it points us beyond HIV to some clues that we have about how people react to these kinds of stigma and the different forms in which the stigma may come. So HIV-related stigma has been seen as a significant barrier to people being willing to receive prevention messages effectively and have them be effective, but also to enter into treatment. Excuse me. And we've seen that HIV-related stigma has ebbed and flowed over the years as treatments have become more and less effective. But really, it's accumulated for individuals who've been HIV positive for a very long time. It has never gone away, and it has accumulated tremendously across time. Well, a group of researchers began to look at what is the kind of stigma that people are facing related to their HIV. And in doing all kinds of interviews with people and collecting some qualitative and quantitative data, they found 3 primary mechanisms of stigma. First of all, and the one we often think of, is enacted stigma. This is when people actually experience prejudice and discrimination from the world around them. But that's not the only kind of stigma that exists. There's also the fear of going out in the public because one expects to receive stigma, to get enacted stigma if you go out and you move in certain situations. That's called anticipated stigma. And then we internalize a lot of those experiences, and we end up holding that stigma in ourselves about ourselves. And so it's the degree to which people endorse or believe society's negative beliefs or feelings about themselves that also forms its own kind of stigma as we apply it to ourselves. Well, that same group of researchers went on and looked at how does this express itself to the individual, and what are the different kinds of outcomes of the different kinds of stigma that they experience. And what they found is that enacted stigma, actually being discriminated against in the world, was a really strong predictor of substance use in that particular individual. But anticipated stigma, that sort of anticipatory anxiety, was a good predictor of depression. And internalized stigma best predicted risky sexual behavior. So that inability to care for oneself in that one particular context. And while this was done specifically with HIV and HIV positive individuals, I think it's really important that as we think about our clients and we think about the role that stigma plays for them, that we look not just at what have they experienced, but what do they believe about themselves? And what do they anticipate as they walk out into the world? Because all of those things are going to have separate and different impacts on the individual. So why is all this so important? Really because people die as a result of it. In the HIV study that was done, people experience a high degree of anticipated stigma, maybe less likely to disclose their HIV status because they fear they'll be socially rejected. Therefore, they may pay less attention to HIV prevention messages on an ongoing basis and may be less willing to seek medical care, particularly if it involves disclosure of their HIV status because of fear of the reaction of the medical personnel that they're working with. And so care gets delayed, disease progresses faster, untreated, and therefore by the time that they do seek medical care, they're very often sicker than they would have been had they felt comfortable accessing these services. Yeah, I beat that one to death. So I want to play a little a movie for you. This is Rachel Wiley, who is a poet who does spoken word on an ongoing basis. And I'm gonna turn it back over, and hopefully our video will work. I'd like, if you would, for you to type your reactions after the video is over into the chat. Go ahead and play the video if you would.
The old joke goes, patient walks into the doctor's office, says, "Doctor, it hurts when I move my arm like this. What should I do?" And the doctor says, "So don't move your arm like that." Now, fat girl walks into doctor's office, says, "Doctor, it hurts when I move my arm like this. What should I do?" And the doctor says, "Have you considered weight loss surgery?" That girl walks into the doctor for a flu shot and gets a lecture about BMI. That girl walks into the doctor's with an earache and gets asked if she's ever eaten a salad. That girl walks into the doctor's office with a spider bite, and the doctor obsesses over how low her blood pressure is. Low for such a fat person anyway. Insists on checking it 3 times before he'll believe it. Forgets completely about the mass of purple spider venom that brought her here to begin with. That girl walks into the doctor's to ask about antidepressants and gets prescribed exercise instead because obviously her depression is because of her fat, and obviously fat bodies never exercise and stay fat. Fat girl walks into the doctor's office for a standard 3-month follow-up appointment, and the doctor says, "Have you considered that weight loss surgery yet?" Fat girl gets tired of constantly being diagnosed as fat. So fat girl stops walking into the doctor's office. Fat girl walks into the world and says, "World, it hurts to exist like this." And the world says, "So stop existing like that." manages to love her fat body. And the world says, stop glorifying obesity. That girl walks into the world and says, I do not owe you shrinking, I do not owe you thinness, attempted thinness or desired thinness, because you assume thinness equals health. For that matter, I do not owe you health, perceived or otherwise, to receive basic respect. I am deserving of care. I am deserving to exist as I do. I am deserving of first, no harm done. And the world says that is the best joke we've heard all day.
As you think about your clients, what reaction do you have about that video? Go ahead and type in the chat for me if you would. Yeah, Renee, anger and sadness. Anyone else want to share your reactions? Thanks, Ben. Rejection. The last acceptable bias. Interesting, Kristen. Thanks, Lisa. Resistance. Diana, powerful. We're just seeing what is on the outside, not what she's feeling on the inside. And Diana, I want to really echo that we can't know what happens when someone faces the kind of bias that they do, what's happening to them on the inside. Yeah, I see that, Kristen, that the acceptable is in quotes. And this kind of medical bias that we're talking about meets people every single day. People who use substances, people who are larger than the average person thinks is acceptable, people whose gender expression is somewhat different than the binary that's mandated in our world, people whose sexual orientation doesn't conform to heteronormative standards. All of these things are met with the kind of fat girl is tired of being diagnosed as fat. You just have to change the issue. And this is who our clients expect to meet when they walk in to see us. And so the question then becomes, why wouldn't our clients be hostile when they meet us? Why wouldn't our clients be defensive? Why wouldn't they be resistant to our suggestion if provider after provider after provider, person after person after person has treated them as fat girl as opposed to as Rachel Wiley? And if we can remember to look past the mark on their forehead, the stigma that they carry around with them because of how we interpret them, suddenly there's hope for healing, there's hope for acceptance, and there's hope for healing in a true word, so that fat girl can be healthy in the way that she decides to be healthy, and she can be beautiful in the way that she is beautiful, and she can be powerful in the way that she is powerful without constantly being beaten down and having to defend herself. That video, as you saw, was played on YouTube, and I'll make sure that the link is included in the slides when we send them out to you. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about a couple of examples of stigmatized communities and the impact of that. And again, I'd like you to think, like with Rachel Wiley's spoken word, I'd like you to think of these as examples that highlight the underlying issue of what stigma does. While it's important in this case, for instance, for the LGBTQ community, it is relevant to everyone who's facing stigma, regardless of what the underlying issue is. So studies have shown that LGBT people, when compared to the general population, use more drugs and alcohol, have higher rates overall of substance use disorders, They have more difficulty withholding or abstaining from alcohol and drug use, and they continue heavy drinking later into life. All of these have been used to say, so there must be something fundamentally wrong with LGBT people if they need to turn to drugs at such a high rate. But again, I would suggest from the video that we just saw that perhaps it's a coping reaction and not an underlying flaw. Trans individuals are much more likely than cisgender individuals to experience violence, and trans women of color in particular have incredibly high rates of violence. There's a great study that was done in 2011. It's a little old now, but unfortunately the percentages haven't changed that much from the more limited data that we have. And they found that 71% of multiracial trans people reported having experienced bullying, physical abuse, sexual assault, harassment, expulsion from school. And 58 to 65% of transgender and gender nonconforming people had experienced assault. In the last 5 years, over 80% and sometimes as high as 95% of known trans murders have been perpetrated against trans women of color. It is dangerous to walk into the world as a trans woman of color, in particular, dangerous to the point when where you may be assaulted or you may be killed. Suicide is much higher in the LGBT populations, among gay men in particular. Gay men are 7 times more likely to have attempted suicide than heterosexual men. Gay youth comprise 30% of deaths from suicides annually. And gay and bisexual men have higher rates of deliberate self-harm than the heterosexual population as well. And so as we look specifically at gay men, but as we look at these stigmatized groups in general, we have to think about not only what's going on the outside of them, but how is this eating them up from the inside and how are they reacting to that? Are they thinking about self-harm? Do they have some active or passive suicidal ideation going on? In a 2014 study looking at Healthy People 2020, which is where we're supposed to have addressed all these issues by this year, according to this 2014 study. Unfortunately, we haven't, and again, these numbers haven't changed that much. The reason I'm using these studies is they're large studies. There are smaller sets of data that indicate and confirm these, but they're more difficult to interpret on their own. LGBT youth are 2 to 3 times more likely to have attempted suicide. And when you look at the homeless population, the vast majority of homeless youth on the streets are members of the LGBT communities. Intimate partner violence or internal to the relationship violence is very widespread. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men were victims of sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, and were known to have negative effects as a result of that. And it starts at a really early age. Before the age of 18, in this country, 8.5 million women experience their first rape, and 1.5 million men are forced to penetrate a partner, again, before the age of 18. Also before the age of 18, 3.5 million women and nearly 1 million men experience their first time being stalked by a partner. Imagine, if you will, the level of stress that, again, this, coupled with all of the other issues that we're talking about, adds to this individual's life. And if we look at different groups, who do you think has the highest rates of intimate partner violence? Heterosexuals, gay men and lesbians, or bisexuals? Well, I won't wait for a response. We'll just move to the question and answer period and discuss it more. But the answer is bisexuals do. And bisexuals experience higher rates of interpersonal violence, but also more negative outcomes than all of the other groups, heterosexual or L, G, or T. Bisexual individuals experience more negative substance use and mental health outcomes on almost every indicator. And really the reason for this is thought to be because they don't fit in anywhere. So those people who are marginalized between groups seem to have more negative outcomes than those who fit well into one group or the other, even if the group they fit well in is often the recipient of discrimination. In case you're not clear on the concept, heterosexuals tend to think bisexual people are just going through a phase, and members of the gay community think they're sitting on the fence and they want to have their cake and eat it too, but they haven't just committed to being gay by that particular point. And so they're not accepted by the heterosexual community, they're not accepted by the homosexual community, and they find themselves walking the fence in between those two communities, leading to more negative outcomes. So just a couple of more examples. Lesbians are less likely to get preventive care for cancer of a variety of sorts, and therefore we see higher rates of cancer that are preventable in lesbian women. Lesbian and bisexual women are more likely to be overweight or obese, with the associated health problems associated with that. Gay men have higher risk for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Again, compounded with being a member of a person of color. So the higher rates overall in the gay community, but the highest rates among gay men of color. Now, Dr. Kim Johnson, who was formerly the director of the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment at SAMHSA in 2017, issued guidance that we should try not to talk so much about stigma and talk instead about discrimination. In doing so, we really are talking about the perpetrator of the problem, the person who discriminates, as opposed to the recipient or victim of the trauma, the person experiencing stigma. And in talking about the perpetrator of the discrimination, we can see it more accurately when it occurs and intervene more effectively to stop it and or prevent it, because we're focusing our attention on the source of the problem rather than the outcome of the problem. Now, across groups, now this is no longer LGBT, but these are just across population groups. If we look at just the impact of gender on people, women were less likely than their male counterparts to be diagnosed and treated effectively, efficiently, and appropriately for heart disease, even with standard presenting symptoms, the way heart attacks always present, meaning that heart disease is still the leading cause of death, one of the leading causes of death among women. In a 5-year survival is lower for Black people than white people for almost all cancers at all stages of diagnosis. That says something about the healthcare that they're receiving. In a 2015 review of Lancet, they found an increase in stroke risk, incidence and mortality, and related negative outcomes among people of lower versus higher socioeconomic status. People with disabilities have higher rates of chronic disease and condition and are significantly less likely to receive preventive care than people without those disabilities. So what we see overall is the cumulative effect of these, all of these conditions leading to an increase in premature death. Whatever the underlying etiology, we know that mental health disorders account for 25% of all years of life lost to disability and premature mortality. Among those who die by suicide, more than 90% have a diagnosable mental health disorder. Suicide continues to be a leading cause of death. And as I said, stigma kills. People with serious mental illness die 25 years earlier on average than the general population. People with a substance use disorder do just a bit worse. They die 26 years earlier than the average population. And unfortunately, no one has ever done the study to see how much earlier people with mental illness and a substance use disorder, the overall mortality impact of that. But we know it's not going to be any better than this, and we know it's likely to be worse. So I know that when I talk about these things, I kind of get an impression already of
Tom, it looks like
yes.
we have some hands raised. At least I was alerted that. So I don't know if somebody wants to chat in about the slide before we move on, or if you want to hold it off until the end.
I'm happy for someone to chat in, or if they can unmute themselves, they're welcome to just talk in if they'd like as well.
Connie, you are unmuted. You have a question.
So I'd like to look at a variety of different ways that these sorts of stigma impact at a variety of different levels. And if we're going to address it, we have to address it at the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, the institutional, the community, and the policy levels, or we're really not addressing the stigma that we're talking about. So interpersonal stigma, toxic shame over, for instance, toxic shame over substance use and behaviors, feeling so bad that you're beating yourself up and therefore you can't kind of see the hope or the light at the end of the tunnel. Internalized hatred over your identity, whether that's sexual orientation or gender identity. Self-esteem is negatively impacted by the belief about who one is and how one fits into the world, including the color of your skin, the shape of your eyes, hair texture, etc. And we see increases in depression and self-harm over this sense of not fitting in a variety of different contexts. And so from an intrapersonal perspective, we as providers need to really look at how the person feels about themselves. And we often go, this person has low self-esteem. But we need to look underneath that and look at some of the underlying etiology of why they have low self-esteem. Do they fit into some of these marginalized communities? And in helping to bring that out, can we help them see that it's the world on the outside, not the person on the inside, that really has the problem? So interpersonal discrimination takes the form of unconscious biases, as we've already talked about. I think we already covered all those in another slide. It's family rejection. The reason that there are so many young LGBT people on the streets is because they have nowhere else to go. And they may have nowhere else to go because when they came out, their families disowned them and threw them out. Lots of people end up on the streets for lots of reasons, but among LGBT people, in addition to all of the poverty and other sorts of issues that move people out onto the streets, they have a much higher rate of this kind of family rejection. Peer harassment and bullying of a variety of sorts, harassment from coworkers, rejection from potential romantic partners or sexual people that you're sexually interested in. From an institutional perspective, we have to look at who has access to health care and who doesn't. The Affordable Care Act increased access to care for many people, but it certainly didn't provide anything close to universal health care. What do we do with those people who fall through the cracks, and how do we make sure that they get the services that they need? Who has access, likewise, to substance use disorder and mental health care? There are now laws that say that mental health and substance use disorder care have to be provided at parity with each other and at parity with health care. But for the most part, those laws are not enforced, and therefore this kind of institutional stigma of those who have insurance of one form or another and those who don't continues to separate out people. What are the policies related to inclusiveness in educational settings, in employment settings, in housing settings? How are issues of race and gender handled in correctional settings? And what is the person's experience with religious institutions, and how has that impacted their view of the world and how they move in the world? Community, we already talked about violence. What are the norms related to substance use? How accepted is substance use in the community? There's a small community on Oahu in Hawaii where they have 3 or 4 generations of people living together in the same house, all using methamphetamine. And actually in that community, you're kind of an oddball if you're not using methamphetamine. Likewise, there's a community in New Mexico that almost everyone in the whole community is using opioids. And it's been studied and studied and studied, trying to figure out how to address the problem. But it's so endemic in the community that it's been really difficult for providers to find a way in, and for people in the community to find a way out of that now normalized behavior. And how does the community go about scapegoating particular groups or marginalizing particular groups? From a policy perspective, there are still, I think it's near a dozen states, although the laws have been changing recently, where you can use the trans or gay panic defense in court. We were about to get intimate, and I suddenly discovered that my potential sexual partner was a trans woman, not a cisgender woman, and so I killed her. That has gotten people off from any kind of prosecution or jail term. I was at a bar, and this guy came up to me and came on to me, and I'm not like that, so I beat the crap out of him. Again, I was freaked out when I discovered something about another person, and therefore that justifies my violence to them. That is still a usable defense in this country. It says a lot about how we value people in this country. Lack of non-discrimination policies, we'll get back to that one in a second. Using the person's legal name and gender as opposed to their identity name and gender. I apologize that it says sex there. It really is about gender. What are the immigration laws like, and how are we dealing with those? Lots on the news these days. In terms of non-discrimination policies, I think this one is really interesting. Across the U.S., there are all kinds of non-discrimination, gender, religion, etc. But the states listed with any color, all of them have protections for non-discrimination protections for sexual orientation. The ones in orange have only protection laws for sexual orientation, but not for gender. And all of the white states have no protections for sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, this is really important because what's being protected in these states is employment discrimination and housing discrimination. This map was true up until about a month ago. This one was printed in 2014, but it didn't change up until the Supreme Court made a ruling that the 1964 Human Rights Act protected LGBT people from employment discrimination. So it hasn't been enacted yet. No one's figured out how to implement it. But theoretically, now in all 50 states, there's employment discrimination. And you can get married in all 50 states. Same-sex couples can get married in all 50 states. But to this day, in all of those places where there are whites, you could get married to your same-sex partner in all of those states and then be evicted from your house. In the orange and the white states, you can identify yourself as a trans person and again not receive employment discrimination, but again your landlord could come even after the Supreme Court ruling and evict you from your house. So we have a long way to go. And I think these kinds of non-discrimination policies really say a lot about how the person is valued in the world, but also how the person feels about themselves in the world, and therefore is an indicator of more extreme outcomes than people who don't face those issues. So cultural practice perspectives. If you think about it, most providers in the field have gone to some sorts of cultural competency training, trainings designed to increase your level of competence. And yet we all come out of those trainings and none of us are really culturally competent because it's really a myth. I can barely be competent in the cultural groups that I fit within, let alone all of the other ones that exist in the world. And I only know a particular culture from the context that I was born in and raised in, not from the context of someone who comes from Central or South America, which is a very different experience than where my family came from. So even if we're culturally competent, we're only culturally competent to the best of our experience and the best of our knowledge. So I like this concept of cultural humility much better. Cultural humility is a lifelong process of looking at and examining and refining your own awareness, knowledge, behavior, and attitudes on the interplay of power, privilege, and social context so that you identify your unconscious biases and prevent yourself, by becoming aware of them, from imposing those biases on your clients that you're interacting with. So we have to engage in constant, ongoing self-reflection and self-critique. We need to look at power imbalances and bring those into check, and really look at and listen to the patient in understanding their problem and in determining what care they need, and look at the impact for that individual of how culture has impacted who they are, where they are, and how they experience the world, and how this may impact the services that you're providing them. So cultural humility requires that you give up your role as an expert. You are an expert in health or in behavioral health, mental health, substance use, but the patient is an expert in them. So when we want them to learn how to be healthier from us, we have to learn about them from them in order to be able to do that effectively and form a partnership accordingly. So by making them a full partner, we engage them in a real therapeutic alliance and make sure that we're not inadvertently reenacting some of that power imbalance that is sort of automatic in the physician-patient relationship, but really engaging in a collaborative process to help the person help themselves to become healthier. So cultural humility requires a respect for difference, and it means bridging perspectives between ourselves and the people with whom we work. But often it's about separating perspectives. It's about seeing where our biases are coming to the fore and holding them to ourselves and not imposing them on the other person. So we have to both bridge and separate in order to truly to come from a culturally humble place. So we have to challenge ourselves to identify, what do I think is normal? What is the norm? And recognize that that's our value in the world, but it may not be our client's value in the world. So we have to remain open to them. It requires consistent self-reflection and checking in with yourself over and over and over again in every context forever. So the test, you have to be open to someone's individuality and recognize, just because you've worked with one, whatever the group is, doesn't mean that the next person from that group will be anything like them. And if you're treating them as if you know them because of some demographic or socially defined characteristic, we are doing the opposite of cultural humility. And we need to reset and look at the person across from us and learn about them from them. So discrimination and stigma are complicated. There is no easy solution. We have to educate ourselves on an ongoing basis. We have to get to know people from a variety of marginalized groups. And recognize that our interaction with them can create obstacles and more stress for them in their daily living. And we have to do everything we can to make our environments opening and welcoming to the diversity of people who may walk through our doors. So we need to listen to and share our perspective, but we need to do it really carefully. We need to not impose. It's not a good answer to say, well, I've treated many people like you before. Oh, I'm not biased in this way because I know people who are like you. Really, in essence, you're disclosing the biases that you hold inside. So we want to disclose to each other, we want to learn, we want to have conversations about these things. But with our clients, we want to be really thoughtful and selective about what we disclose and when we disclose it, so that we're not imposing on them the care for us and fixing our issue as opposed to what they're really there for. So we want to avoid labeling them in any way, listen to them and let them label themselves if labels are needed. We want to continually get training like this one and many others. We want to use person-first language. It's not the addict, it's the person with a substance use disorder. It's not the schizophrenic, it's a person with schizophrenia. It's not the HIV-infected person, it's a person living with HIV. And if we can put the person first, we're less likely to respond to them according to the biases that we hold, and more likely to respond to them as an individual. We also need to work within our agencies to create an atmosphere that is supportive with a zero tolerance policy for discrimination. I do a lot of training for LGBTQ communities, which is one reason why I use them as a major example in this particular training. But just as one example of where we tolerate discrimination, I was walking through a substance use agency and one client to another used the N-word in a way that was supportive of each other, but we can't even say the N-word out loud anymore for lots of really good reasons, because of how powerful that word is and how negatively it's heard, particularly when coming from outside of the group. And yet in that same agency where people were using the euphemism for the N-word, the word fag came out 8 or 10 times, which is also a really violent, discriminating word that no one paid any attention to as I was walking through the course of the agency. We don't tolerate one kind of discrimination, but somehow there's great tolerance for another kind of discrimination. So we need to acknowledge who the individual is, bring them in with all of the support that they hold, and treat them with respect and consideration. Now, what if a person's values conflict with your own? What if, for instance, you believe that homosexuality is a sin, people of certain skin colors are inferior to others, that your religion is the true religion and no other religion counts, that women should not hold certain kinds of jobs, or that people with disabilities should not be seen in the workplace? One, we all have biases. It's important to know what yours are, but it's also really critical to think about how that impacts your work. Do these biases make you not want to work with particular individuals just because of who they are and how they're represented within these groups? Well, first of all, I'd invite you to see cultural humility. Those are your values, those are your beliefs, they are not the client's, and we need to find a way to separate those two things out and honor the person sitting in front of you. Yes, also the word retard, Connie, I see that in the chat. It's absolutely so stigmatizing, so belittling as we understand it. Now, there was a time when that was a word that was accepted to describe people with certain sorts of challenges, but we now know how hurtful that word is. I appreciate you bringing that up. So, if you don't want to work with certain kinds of people because of who they are, which religious group, which sexual orientation, et cetera, I would challenge you that it's going to be really, really hard for you to do ethical work with anyone. Because what the ethics of our profession say that we need to give everyone equal access to care free from discrimination. So a lot of people say, well, I'll just talk to my supervisor about it and they'll let me not work with those kinds of people. Again, really hard to do ethical work in that context if that's what you're hoping. We need to seek supervision. And your supervisor may say, until we figure out how you can deal with these issues in a more appropriate way, I don't want you to see those kinds of clients because it's not good for the client. And we're going to work with you to help you learn to deal with that. That's fantastic. Learning and growing as a professional, learning to address and identify your biases and to deal with them in an effective way, fantastic. But if you automatically start marginalizing and parsing out who you will work with and who you won't work with based on these kinds of characteristics, I'd encourage you to consider gardening as a field. We talked about all of those things before. The ethics of our profession, as I said, mandate equitable, free treatment. And so we have to do the work. We can't expect our clients to do the work. But what if the research according to the research about treatment says that we need to provide a kind of treatment that conflicts with our own personal values? We need to not do change therapy on members of the LGBT community because it has been shown to be directly harmful, and yet you personally believe in that. We need to provide medicines for addiction treatment when you believe that people should be able to get over their addiction and enter recovery without those kinds of medicines. Well, see cultural humility again. Your beliefs are really important to you and need to be held to you. And the mandate of our profession is that we provide the best care possible for that individual, at least access to that care. And the best care that we have available are those that have been demonstrated through science to be effective. Now, if we don't have those things, if the client chooses something else, or the client chooses to add on to those in addition to those evidence-based practices, good for them and more power to them. But we need to be willing to at least present what we know from the evidence as the best practices that are available for that individual. Yeah, I covered that. All right, just a couple more slides and then I'm going to open it up for questions. Language matters. I hope I've made that point. If you walk away with nothing else, that's what I want you to walk away with. And yet in the field of addiction services, substance use disorder treatment services, see, I just did it, we still have common stigmatizing language that's a part of our field. I just demonstrated one of those. I used addiction as with a substance use disorder. My friend is a drug addict. She can't get clean. This is the one that kills me, people. He had a dirty test. He was dirty. That's how we often describe a dirty test. It's not that the individual had a positive test for a substance or a negative test for a substance, but the person is often described as clean or dirty. I'm just going to let that be what it is. Our community has a serious drug abuse problem. Again, used to be the language of our field. It's evolved to more person-forward language. And so there are a variety of ways that we have used stigmatizing language. And for every one of those, there's a non-stigmatizing alternative. And I would recommend that each and every person do a audit of all of the stuff that you hand out to clients, all of the stuff in your room, and look and see what kinds of stigmatizing language you're handing to the individual as you interact with them or they're seeing in your environment. Language matters. Words have power. We need to put the person before the disease, and we can go a long way to helping them achieve health and a happy life. I'm going to stop there. I went a little over my slated time, but we still have about 15 minutes for questions. And I will encourage you, please, to type in the chat or raise your hand and we'll unmute you. And let's take a few questions. Karen, you referenced a particular comment as powerful, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to expand on that a little bit. What did you find important that I said?
introduce your.
Sure, Dr. Fries. This is Karen. Thank you so much for all of your comments, and specifically the piece about if I'm discriminating, and I know I'm discriminating against a particular client based on any of the factors we've been talking about or other things, that it would be difficult to expect that I can deliver ethical care for other clients, or broadening the ethical point about what's needed, what patients need, free from our judgment.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, the first time I heard that comment, I work really hard, and I have my whole career to be open to everybody and to identify my biases. So this has come fairly natural to me, although it's a lot of work, even as I pursue that goal. But the first time I heard it stated in exactly that way, it took my breath away, because it's so powerful to say you can't be ethical if you're going to hold on to your biases and not let them go.
Yes, so thanks
you
for
that comment.
Powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer asked a comment: how is cultural humility important, especially at a time like now with the social climate about race and ethnicity? Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. I think that there's lots of ways we talk about bias and discrimination. We talk about stigma, and we talk about the impact of someone's race and ethnicity on who they are and how they are in the world. This is simply one layer of the onion that we're talking about. And for me, this is important as a fundamental before we really start exploring broader issues of like structural racism, because this is my responsibility within the world. And in that context, it really doesn't matter which bias I hold. I'm responsible for identifying it. I'm telling you, people, love your biases, own your biases, revel in your biases, and celebrate them all you want, for yourself, by yourself, with other people in your circle who hold those as well. But in a world, not particularly, in the world, we're responsible for knowing those and not inflicting them on others. And so by starting from a place of cultural humility, we begin to open ourselves up to understand the world from others' experience and to understand where I have privilege and where I don't, and the impact of my privilege on others and the impact of others' privilege on me. We can begin to see other layers of how the world operates and begin to try to become anti-racist, which also includes anti-sexist and anti-genderist and anti-heterosexist and all of those other things. We can move toward becoming anti-racist with this spirit of, I need to understand myself so that I can understand the world. And that's the fundamental tenet of cultural humility. It's a great question. Thank you very much. What are some things that can be done in primary care or the administrative settings to incorporate cultural humility into patient care and communication? I think one of them I kind of obliquely suggested, and I think we need to do a careful audit of our intake forms in particular, and those introductory assessments into care. These are all done, all of those forms that we hand a person in the waiting room, and then the initial conversations that we have as the person moves back into our care settings, whether it's a primary care setting and the interactions with the medical assistant as they're taking the vitals, or the nurse who takes you into a room and inquires about the condition, or the physician who's doing that initial patient interview as they get to know you. All of those are potential points at which what we earlier referred to as microaggressions can begin to be heaped on the individual. And so by doing a careful audit of your own paperwork and looking at, how do we ask the question of gender? Or do we ask the question of gender? Or do we just assume gender based on appearance? How do we deal with race and ethnicity? Do you only use the government identified descriptors? Or do you expand to really be responsive to the treatment population that you're servicing in your particular agency? We're doing a conference in a few weeks specifically on Guam about Pacific Islanders. And we have to use the government identified descriptors for race and ethnicity, which is Asian, Pacific Islander, African American, blah, blah, blah. And often, because Pacific Islanders are so small, they get lumped in with Asians, so we never learn anything about them. Well, just for the 6 U.S. affiliated Pacific jurisdictions, we have 13 specific Pacific Islander ethnicities that we need to specifically ask about in order to be responsive to that particular community. Are your forms responsive to your population? And so I would say by doing that audit and looking at the language that you're using in all of those initial introductory forms and interactions to move the person into care, the more you can expunge all of those things, the better. Once they get to know us, our patients, they'll be much more forgiving. They'll know we have their best intentions at heart and that we're not purposefully being jerks to them, but actually are just making mistakes. But until they get to know us, we can easily become just another provider who's doing just the same thing as the last provider, treating them with disrespect. And if they walk out the door feeling that way, they are unlikely to walk back in the door. And the end result of that is they die. Let's keep them alive. That's our goal. Let's actually move better than that. Let's move them toward health. That's our goal. And to do that, they have to be willing to engage with us. I think we control all of that in the way that we interact with them. Then they get to make free choices. I hope that helps, Jennifer. What are some of the other activities that can be done to further my lifelong learning and self-examination of my values? I think there are a number of things. When we were doing this training face-to-face, it's a 3-hour training, and when I originally wrote it, it's a 6-hour training. And mostly what we did in both the 3-hour and the 6-hour version was values clarification, making lists of what are your most important values and what do they say about who you are and how you operate in the world. There are sheets that have value statements, and you kind of circle the ones that are there, looking at how your values interact with another person's values and where there's points of synergy, but more important, where there are points of conflict between your values and another, when all you're looking at is positive values. They can be really intense conversations just about world perspective and world view, but what you're really doing in those conversations is pulling out your unconscious internalized biases. So I think anything that you can do that relates to values clarification can be really helpful. I think the other thing, just my brain is operating in the world of assessments right now. So I think assessments like Strength Finder and similar kinds of assessments where you look at what you're really good at and what you capitalize on in your interactions in the world, but also every strength has a dark side if we overuse it or we don't use it in the right context. And so by learning really about what your strengths are as you move in the world, you're also learning a lot about what your weaknesses are as you move in the world and the areas that you need to overcome. If one of your strengths, for instance, is organizing, you may organize yourself into a little tiny box and not be able to get out of it. And yet you may have difficulty as you're putting all the pieces together into an organized whole, seeing the individual elements that are going into that, kind of as you group things together to make them organized. Well, if that begins to bleed out to an individual, we may have difficulty seeing the parts of them that don't conform to our overall vision, and we may organize them into a thing as opposed to seeing the individual in front of us. They may be a gay guy as opposed to Tom, who expresses a sexual orientation in the context of his racial and ethnic identity in a world of a particular class expression, et cetera, et cetera. So all of our strengths are all of our weaknesses, and I think exploring those goes a long way. The other thing that I think we have to do is we have to be open to feedback. We have to be able to hear from others when they very subtly tell us we've been offensive, when they bite our heads off because we said something that we didn't even notice might be offensive, when they scream at us, when they cry, when they don't come back, when they come back and they're angry. All of those potentially have something to do with us as a provider. If we listen to our colleagues, we listen to our friends, and we listen to our clients carefully through the lens of cultural humility, often the feedback that we're getting on an ongoing basis, if we can be open and not defensive to it, is telling us something about our underlying values and the ways that we're expressing them, in this case, inappropriately, and therefore moving us toward better, more active solutions that are promoting of the individual we're interacting with. We are about 2 minutes before the hour, so we might have time for one more, or seeing not a flood of them come in over the chat, it might be a good time to wrap up. In case there's more questions that come in, I'll just say the websites that are on your screen right now, the PSATTC, that's the Pacific Southwest ATTC. There's lots of free resources that are available to you on this and a wide variety of other substance-related topics. UCLA ISAP is one of the largest research groups in the world looking at issues of substance use, and there's lots of resource and original research reports available there. And YMSMLGBT.org is a great resource and compendium of information for young men who have sex with men, the YMSM part, and LGBT populations, including treatment resources as well as a compendium of research for that population. I'd like to say thank you again to all of the sponsors, to Ben at the ORN for organizing this, and for the opportunity to speak to you all. Feel free to email me if you have any questions in the future, and I'd be happy to respond to those.
Thank you, Dr. Freeze. That was a wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone for attending today's presentation. You will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you can complete the survey and provide feedback. If you have any further questions, please contact me, Jennifer Trujillo, at jtrujillo@nvpca.org. On behalf of the Nevada Primary Care Association, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.